Today the topic of our discussion is the species category, in which we will be talking about the microtaxonomy. One of the most elementary urges of the human mankind is to name the organisms, and on the basis of those names they used to identify the organisms. Even the most primitive people named various kinds of animals and plants and organisms. If only individual organisms existed and the diversity of nature were continuous, it would be difficult to sort them into groups and distinguish kinds. So, the first and most basic task of a taxonomist is to sort the confusing, the bewildering diversity of the individuals that is found in the nature. And that is represented in the form of different species. It is impossible to construct a classification until the several species that are to be ordered are correctly discriminated. Discriminated means that they are identified on the basis of their differences. And the most important thing for the discrimination is the choice of certain characters which are valid and which are non-plastic, on the basis of what we can identify animals. For example, if you consider human beings as Homo sapiens, they have certain non-plastic characters and they do have certain plastic characters. And if you think of certain plastic characters, that may be the color, the skin tone, and it varies as we go from one place to another. For example, a Homo sapien of Africa is a bit darker in its complexion and skin tone as compared to a Homo sapien of Australia. So the character which is needed for the identification or for the discrimination of an organism must be valid. We cannot use we cannot use a plastic character, basically. For example, on the other hand, if you consider the number of teeth or the dentition pattern of Homo sapiens, then you would be easily understanding that what is the importance of a non-plastic character, because the number and the dentition pattern remains similar, rather same, in different parts of the world of the same species. So there were different criteria which were used for the discrimination of the several species, and the identification of the characters which are valuable characters for the discrimination of the species, for the identification of the species, was very important. The activities by which this is achieved constitute microtaxonomy. So whenever you are working on the species category and we are trying to find out that what certain characters are important and how variation must be used for the identification of a species, this field develops and constitutes microtaxonomy. The recognition of species is not an easy matter. There are difficulties at several levels. Most of the difficulties are on the basis of the literal usage of the words, literal usage of the terms. And they are confusing for us. So there are various terms like phanon, taxon, and category. These terms are used generally in our study of microtaxonomy. So we have to understand these basic terms before we start working on the other part of this presentation. The second problem which we generally face is the visible diversity of nature among whole organisms include two levels of the discontinuity that are of special interest and that are of special importance to the taxonomist. Number one is at the individual level, at the phenotypic level, and number 2 is at the reproductive level. So we generally consider these two major things for the understanding of a species, or for the discrimination of a species, or to carry out microtaxonomy. The activities by which this is achieved constitute microtaxonomy. The recognition of species is not an easy matter, and there are various problems when we are working on it. Insoluble problems are posed by incipient species, that is, populations that have some of the properties of the species but lack others. For example, there are certain problems which we generally face when a species is undergoing through a process of speciation. For example, if one species is being diverged to form two different species or more species, then that particular time at which the process of speciation would be occurring, it would be difficult for taxonomists to identify or to categorize a particular species into particular group and into particular species. So how we generally work with it, because there are problems. For example, you find animals all around you, and there are animals who have different fauna, and there are animals who are very similar to each other, and there are animals who are very similar to each other, yet they are reproductively isolated, and there are animals which are not so similar with each other, however they are not reproductively isolated. So the criteria of reproductive isolation, along with the morphological identity, works together to make you understand, or make a taxonomist understand the status of a species, the identification of a species. Taxonomists must adopt criteria that permit them to distinguish between these two levels. What two levels? The reproductive isolation and the morphology. And must learn how to apply these criteria properly. So there are certain ways how we work on these, how we work on to solve these problems, and they have been discussed in the later chapters and the later lectures. Since much of the confusion in taxonomic literature is due to misunderstanding and the consequent erroneous application of certain terms, so we begin by offering definitions of a number of terms that are generally commonly used. You can understand it well. The term facilitates the description of the taxonomic procedure, because when we are working on the taxonomic procedure, we have not yet identified, however we are just working on it, and we have to describe a species by telling the ranges of its characters. Then we will be using the term fauna or fanon, because we have to, for example, if you are working on the snails, we have an idea that there are whorls, there are penultimate whorl, or shell length or shell width, and ranges from 0 to 10. Then the fanon will be supporting us to describe species more sensibly, because then we would be able to say that this fauna, and this fauna are the variants of the same species. Like we say that Africans, Australians, Asians are different fauna of the Homo sapiens. These are the fauna of Apis mellifera. These are different fauna of the species Apis mellifera. So in one species there might be different fauna. A drone has a different fauna, a queen has a different fauna, a worker has a different fauna. So fauna is the term which is used to facilitate the process of classification and process of identification. A taxon is defined as concrete objects of zoological classification. A taxon is defined as a group of organisms recognized as a formal unit at any level of hierarchic classification. Basically, a group of organisms are defined in a taxa. For example, mollusca is a taxa, and if it has been assigned a hierarchic level, it would be phylum. A taxon is a named taxonomic group of any rank that is considered sufficiently distinct to be formally recognized and assigned to a definite category. So it means that any group of organisms which has similar characteristics and that may belong to any rank. For example, if you are considering phylum, the category of phylum, the taxa would be mollusca. If you are considering the category of class, the taxa would be gastropoda. And if you are considering the category of order, the taxa would be Basomatophora. The delimitation calls attention to the fact that the delimitation of a taxon against other taxa of the same rank is usually subject to the judgment taxonomist, which is the major service of a taxonomist. And this is the task of a taxonomist, that if a taxonomist is discriminating different taxa belonging to the same class. For example, if a taxonomist is trying to discriminate between gastropoda or bivalvia, it means it is the task of a taxonomist to use sensibly the non-plastic characters and the plastic characters to understand that to which taxa the animal belongs to. Either the animal belongs to the taxa gastropoda or the animal belongs to the taxa bivalvia. Now, what are the basic concepts and basic concerns of the new systematics in the delimitation of the species? So, the major things which we need to do when we are working as a taxonomist is to understand the geographical variation of the species. And I mean to say that what variations are there in different geographic populations of a particular species, so that the case of synonymy or a case of homonymy can be avoided. Then we should understand the recognition of polytypic species. Polytypic species are the species which have more than one morph, which have different types. They are of different morphs. So if one species has various morphs, it also increases confusion if the taxonomy has been done or the microtaxonomy has been carried out in a wrong manner, because it also increases the case of homonymy and synonymy. Synonymy means that if one species has been given more than one name in the different parts of the world or in the different parts of a country, one species has been given different names, it will increase confusion. And on the other hand, homonymy is a case in which two different species have been given the same name. So it is very important to understand the geographic variation within a species, and it is very important to understand or to study the characters of a species in detail and covering a larger area of its distribution. And secondly, recognition of the polytypic species. If a species has more than one morphs or it has more than one types, it means that we have to understand that this species has numerous ecophenotypes, and we should not increase the case of homonymy or synonymy. Rather, we should work very carefully to name the species Then number 3, definition of subspecies and species. Number 4, taxonomic status of incipient species. The species which are in the process of speciation, they must be studied properly in detail so that they can be given a taxonomic status. And number 5, role of non-morphological characters. Non-morphological characters are certain characters which are being used and for the taxonomic work, and it is very important. Again, like we look at the morphological characters, it is again very important to look at the molecular characters, whether they are valid or either they are valid or they are non-valid. So it's very important to understand the role of non-morphological characters in the species identification. There are 2 activities which are very different and very important in the field of microtaxonomy. Number 1, delimitation and proper ranking of the species population. Delimitation means to make it sure that the species has been well defined, considering various different characters, again the variations, and using all those variations, using the characters, we confine or we define the species, and we, being a taxonomist, you can tell that this species has this much range of characters, or the color ranges from white to red, or the tail length ranges from, or the canine length ranges from 0 to 2 millimeters. That depends upon the animal you are working on. So the delimitation and the proper ranking of species is extremely important when you are working. Then the sorting and evaluation of characters. Again, I'm telling you that the characters on the basis of which you are identifying a species is of extreme importance. Whether that character works well or whether that character is important for the identification purpose, or it must not be considered. That has to be very much clear to the taxonomist during the construction of the classification. The difference is acknowledged in the recognition of 2 remarkably independent domains of taxonomy, and they are microtaxonomy and macrotaxonomy. Actually, at least in sexually producing higher organism, the diversity of nature is discontinuous and consists in any local fauna of more or less well-defined kinds of animals we call species. Because we have generally we have described species using the reproductive isolation principle, in which we say that if 2 individuals to produce fertile offspring, it means that they belong to the same species. However, there are certain other problems which are needed to be dealt. So that is the reason why why the species concepts have been discussed very much in the past, and why they are being considered so much in the present. If the species concept is defined and the taxonomists can easily make everyone understand that what species is and how it should be identified, then it would be easier task for the people who are working in different groups, and there are different specialist groups, and they're working on the identification of those particular groups. So it would become easier for them to understand the diversity and its conservation. The concept of species seems so simple that it always comes as something of a shock to a beginning taxonomist to learn how voluminous and seemingly endless the debate about species problem has been. Initially, when we generally understand the species concept, that it is on the basis of the reproductive isolation, then at that point of time, to a new beginner or to a new taxonomist, it is not a big deal to deal with the species identification. However, with the passage of time, with the mature, when it has a mature, when it becomes a mature, when it comes to a mature understanding of the taxonomy, we can be shocked with the complexity of the problem. So the working taxonomist sorts specimens, individuals, into phaena and decides which of them belong to a single taxon of the species category. So initially we generally decide on the basis of the phaena, but in the later lectures I will be telling you other characters are also important to understand the concept of the species. If taxon defined as morphospecies in such a way that it coincides with the phanon, the taxonomist may facilitate the task of sorting. However, the result will be meaningless scientifically. This is because if you are just sorting things on the basis of the morphology, then definitely you will be doing a very wrong thing, or any taxonomist would be doing a wrong thing, because the difference on the basis of the races, the difference on the basis of the sexual dimorphism, the difference on the basis of the seasonal varieties, the difference on the basis of the age variations, that would be ignored, and every different morph will be categorized into different species. So that would increase the confusion. That would be meaningless. So if a taxon defined as morphospecies in such a way that it coincides with the phanon, the taxonomist may facilitate the task of sorting. And it is not only the sorting which is required, because sorting would be just on the basis of the morphology. It would not be the true understanding of the species. The objective of the microtaxonomy is to facilitate the assembling of the phaena into biological meaningful taxa on the species level. On the biological meaningful taxa on the species level means that we have to understand every single character of a species biologically, and we have to study every single character of a species in context to its living, with its ecological niche. We have to consider every species as a genetic unit, as an ecological unit, and then we will be able to understand, or we will be able to identify, or we will be able to categorize a group of animals into species.